Welcome to Get Strong with Kaizzad. Let's get down to the execution of the exercise. This exercise is called as the crunch. Neville, can you show us the crunch, please? Okay, breathe. Give me 2 more reps. Okay. So those were 5 repetitions of the exercise that we call as the crunch. Now basically what happened? The muscle shortened and lengthened. And in any exercise that you do, including the ubiquitous biceps that everybody does, right? The most common representation of resistance exercise is what? The curl. And hence what's happening in a curl? So you've got the biceps brachii, the upper arm, and basically what you're doing is you're working the muscle in the direction of the muscle fibers, you're using them to lift your lower arm, and what's happening to them? They're shortening. This is exactly what we're achieving with the rectus abdominis. This is a real beginner movement, and I'm going to show you progression in this movement, but first see the biomechanics of a crunch. Your feet are up. Okay, your feet can be on a bench, your feet can be anchored, there's no problem. In fact, if you anchor the feet, you'll be able to generate more force and crunch harder. People generally find doing the crunch easier when they anchor their feet, and they normally see that as a problem. They always want to see how the movement can be made more difficult. Well, the reason why it's easier is because by anchoring your feet, you're capable of generating more power. And you should be in a position to generate more power. So you could rest your feet on a bench. You could have somebody anchoring the feet, okay? And thus, with the anchoring, allow more power generation to happen. Anyways, watch the execution. Hands are intertwined behind the head. Now, I know a lot of people basically advise the hands to be at the sides of the head and not really intertwined behind because they're worried about people tugging and pulling against the cervical and basically causing some kind of damage to the cervical spine. Well, when people put their hands at the sides of the temples, like this, and when they do a crunch, do it. Most often what happens is towards the end of the repetitions, the hands sort of leave the head, and it gives a false notion of the range of motion that the person is actually doing. The movement is more on the arms than actually of the trunk. I normally like exercises being done where the body is tied up as one unit with no loose ends. Hence, I always advise that the person basically intertwine the hands behind the head. Okay? Orient yourself for being rolled up like a carpet. And hence, I would like the elbows actually to be inwards. It just basically orients the body to curl up into a fetal position much better. Now, one more thing. Chin. A lot of group fitness instructors in aerobic studios, when they're instructing 20 people at a time, normally ask the person not to basically reduce this distance between the chin and the chest. Again, safety is taking precedence over effectiveness. And in the group fitness environment, I wouldn't say that is wrong. You really can't pinpoint who's doing what when you're instructing 20 people. And hence, to play it safe and to err on the side of safety, basically an instruction is given that think of a ball between your chin and your chest and do not allow the cervical to bend. Actually, that's not true. When you're trying to create the maximum shortening of the abdominals, the body needs to curl, needs to totally and completely go into a fetal position, and that starts from the cervical. But the pull, the generation of power should be coming from the abdominals and not from your lats, not from your arms. You shouldn't be using your arms and lats to pull the head towards the knees. You should be using abdominal strength. On a one-on-one personal trainer type instruction, it is possible to basically teach the person how to use abdominal strength and not yank at the head. Now here, the head is not being yanked. There is no pressure on the cervical. The chin basically starts off by coming down to the chest, and the body basically rolls towards the knees like a carpet. I hope you got that. Watch the execution again. One more point before you watch the execution. Very important to empty the abdominal cavity of air. Hence, you will see Neville exhaling forcefully as he shortens the abdominals. That just basically intensifies the contraction of the abdominals. Neville, again, 5 reps. Very important to keep coming back to the ground again, completely unfurling, completely rolling back. A lot of group fitness instructors basically teach you to pulse at the top. So Neville, just try that. Okay, again, keep pulsing, keep pulsing. Now this is going to create kind of a lactic acid burn. Basically, when you take the repetitions way beyond 15 reps to 20 and 25 and 30 and 40 and 50, and yes, you've heard of people doing abdominal crunches for hundreds of reps at a time. Obviously, in that kind of a scenario, there is lactic acid buildup and the abdominals really burn. For the lactic acid buildup to happen, obviously the repetitions have to go way beyond 50 repetitions. Or sometimes the lactic acid burn can even come a little earlier, but basically if you're feeling the burn, it means that you've been contracting for way too long. Duration is basically the enemy of intensity. Longer the duration, inversely lower the intensity. So obviously if you're doing 100 reps, each contraction is weak, it's of a low intensity, and that is why you're capable of doing hundreds of reps. Hence the contraction has to be so strong that you would normally fail between 10 to 15 reps, okay, if not lesser than 10 reps. If you're capable of doing 30, 35 crunches, then you must move on to another level of progression. Basically, any exercise that you do for hypertrophy should basically restrict you to less than 15 or 10 repetitions. The best would be a 6 rep max. But how do you get a 6 rep max with an exercise where you're using your body weight, and that also you're using a quarter of your body weight? Okay, if you remember the crunch, do the crunch again. Do about 2 repetitions of the crunch. Well, you are shortening the abdominal wall, the rectus abdominis, with the crunch, and hence effectively you are using just this much of your body as resistance against gravity. So now, supposing you're capable of doing 30, 40 repetitions, obviously the muscles will get stronger, they will adapt, and this part of the body will not offer as much resistance as it used to when you started out with the exercise. Correct? Now, let's assume that you don't have any machines, you don't have any cables in which you can add resistance to this particular exercise. You should move on to another exercise which is called as a reverse crunch. Now, this particular episode on abdominals is going to keep on breaking myths. One more myth that needs to be broken is that this reverse crunch is an exercise to increase the resistance on your abdominals. In the reverse crunch, again, reminding you about anatomy, basically the rectus abdominis are 2 paired sheaths that arise from the pelvis and attach themselves to the rib cage, right? So basically these sheaths of muscle can shorten by the rib cage coming to the pelvic region or the pelvic region coming to the rib cage. Effectively, the workout that the muscles go through or the resistance that the muscles go through or the type of resistance is the same, but when you do a reverse crunch, you're using the lower body as the source of resistance and hence obviously more weight. Okay, I'll let you all see this exercise, which is wrongly called as a lower abdominal exercise. There is no such thing as a lower abdomen. The rectus abdominis sheath is one continuous sheath going from the pelvic region to the rib cage. One continuous sheath. And hence there is no lower and upper. Whether you shorten the rectus abdominis sheath with the rib cage going to the pelvic region, you've already seen that, or you bring the pelvic region to the rib cage, the kind of exercise that you're doing is actually the same. It's just that instead of using less than half of your upper body as resistance, you're using the entire lower body weight as resistance. Neville, can you show us about 5 repetitions of the reverse crunch? So let's see the execution of the reverse crunch, wrongly labeled as a lower abdominal exercise. Basically, the reverse crunch is a crunch. It's just that most people identify with the crunch as done with the upper body coming towards the lower body. There is a rib cage coming towards the pelvic region. In this version, it is a progression. Basically, we're getting the pelvic region to the rib cage just to increase the level of resistance. Instead of using quarter of your upper body, you're using the entire lower body as the source of resistance. It is as simple as going from a 10-pound dumbbell to a 20-pound dumbbell. Okay? Watch. Pelvic region, rib cage. Instead of rib cage going to pelvic region, the pelvic region comes to rib cage. Have it. Again. Correct. Thank you, Neville. Now, this could also be erroneously called as the leg raise. This is not a leg raise, this is a hip raise. You're raising the hip. The legs are moving because the legs are attached at the hip. There is no movement at the hip, there is movement off the hip. Basically, the hip gets rolled off the ground by the shortening of the abdominals. So now we're going to see the exercise called as the leg raise. As I said, the reverse crunch also can be misunderstood by people as the leg raise, but you all have seen this exercise. Most people do it with their hands alongside the body. Neville, you just need to show a leg raise. And that's what they do. They basically lift their legs off. They keep the legs in a plank position. They bring it back down and they lift it off. Now, the problem with this exercise is that, yes, the abdominals will be under tension. There will be some intra-abdominal pressure as you lift the legs up to maintain stability of the trunk. But the rectus abdominis, the muscle, is not shortening or lengthening, it is remaining static. Hence, it's going through an isometric contraction while your hip flexors, muscles called as the iliopsoas, basically are shortening and lengthening. Do that again. Hence, there is movement at the hip joint. And we want movement at the trunk. Remember, the rectus abdominis function is not hip flexion. The rectus abdominis function is trunk flexion. Now, are you seeing any trunk flexion happening? Now, if Neville were to do the reverse crunch, do the reverse crunch. The reverse crunch, the legs are already flexed at the hip joint. Flexion's already happened, right? And now there will be flexion of the trunk happening from the hip side. Do you see that? Watch. Okay, that's it, Neville. Many people also tend to combine a leg raise with a reverse crunch. So they'll start off with the legs on the floor and then they'll whip the legs up using hip flexor strength and then carry over onto a reverse crunch. So Neville, show that. Again, go all the way down and whip it up. Right? Okay. Now, on the face of it, this looks like a better exercise because the range of motion seems to be more. But the range of motion at the trunk is exactly the same. And basically, you're using the weight of the legs and the momentum that the legs gain to actually assist the abdominals. So in fact, more load is placed on the abdominals. The abdominals have to do more work if you do the reverse crunch with the legs already flexed at the hip joint. Do that again. The reverse crunch, the way it's supposed to be done. Now, he is actually lifting the whole weight of the lower body and shortening the rectus abdominis. Whereas, if he goes all the way down, it looks like increased range of motion, which usually means more workload, but he's actually using hip flexor strength to whip his legs up. Do that again. Hip flexor strength to whip his legs up. And the momentum, the inertia that the legs are gaining is basically pulling the hip off the floor and not abdominal strength. So to conclude this episode of an exercise meant for the rectus abdominis, and yes, I have discussed only one exercise, not two exercises. They look like two different exercises, but they're meant for the same function of the rectus abdominis. We did the crunch and the reverse crunch. Again, I repeat, the reverse crunch is not meant for the so-called lower abdominals. The reverse crunch is a progression over the crunch. The crunch uses about quarter of the upper body as its source of resistance. The reverse crunch uses the entire weight of the lower body as a source of resistance. Hence, when the forward crunch starts to become easy, go on to the reverse crunch and then forget about the forward crunch. If you're only doing the reverse crunches and you're not doing any regular crunches, that does not mean that the rectus abdominis is being trained incompletely. You either require the crunch or the reverse crunch. You don't require both. Remember, these exercises, or let me just say one exercise, the crunch, is going to stay with you for a very short time. It's going to be with you through the beginner phase. The moment your rectus abdominis starts strengthening and the moment your rectus abdominis gets adapted to the resistance provided by the lower body, you need to move on and you need to progress. What's not going to change is the fact that the rectus abdominis will be trained through trunk flexion. But this trunk flexion can be provided with more resistance through different progressive versions of the same exercise. And we'll see that in the second episode. I hope you found this episode really informative. I've busted a lot of myths in this episode with regards to abdominals. And if you all have really found this worthwhile and you all enjoy videos, informative videos like this, then do subscribe to TheHealthSite.com.